the reason for depression is not a chemical imbalance.
No,
Why is that? Because I
because
mean,
what happened is in I think it was the 1970s, one of the drug companies, Eli Lilly, okay, they were looking for some reason why their antidepressant drugs worked, and they didn't have one. You know, so that made them look stupid. So they had to come up with one. So they made one up, the chemical imbalance theory. They said, "Oh, well, our antidepressants are chemicals, and they make the person feel somewhat better sometimes. So it must be a chemical imbalance." There was no study on it. There was no research on it. They just made it up and went with it. And then big pharma and the who controls the universities. They still control the universities. They still control what's taught in the medical schools. If these people try to teach anything they don't like, they're out of there. They don't put they control what papers are being published. They control what papers they'll put money behind. It's all stuff that supports their business.
so what is the real reason for depression if it's not a chemical imbalance?
Well, you look at how depressive people think. You know, it's a lot of negative stuff, you know, and a lot of it stems from trauma. And so, if you look for a root of mental illness, it's trauma. You know, trauma underlies virtually all psychological dysfunction, and especially schizophrenia. Because you're not going to find too many schizophrenics who weren't badly traumatized. They were either, you know, voracious, horrendously mentally abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused, or physically abused. Um, Other reasons for schizophrenia is amphetamines. When I was working in the psych department of the state prison, more prisoners were locked up in that prison for amphetamine psychosis. So, you know, they think, oh, I was hallucinating. So they start using that stuff. They start hearing voices and they go, well, that's just a hallucination. And they go, it'll fade away. And when they come down, it does. It may do the same thing for maybe 25, 30, 50 times. They come down and the voices disappear. And then one day they don't. They're there forever. They're there permanently. And they're not going away. And they're just as psychotic now as any of the other prisoners who were psychotic from other reasons. The voices don't go away. It's one of the biggest causes of psychosis of any of the drugs out there. The prisoners called it the devil's drug for good reason. So a lot of these guys that were on amphetamine, um, and they're hearing voices, and they kill somebody, and they end up in the courtroom, and they go, "Well, I don't even remember doing it," and they don't because they didn't do it. The voices did.
Do you think that some people just use that as an excuse to commit crimes, or is it
You know,
more rampant?
well, it's pretty common. It's these voices are not hallucinations. And so we talked about them being persistently and consistently negative. So nobody at the state hospital when I was there was the least bit interested in asking these people, the schizophrenics, what the voices were telling them. You know, and all of them, and I believed at the time too that when I got there, I believed the schizophrenia was caused by a chemical imbalance of the patient's brain. That's what I've been taught in graduate school. That's what all the books say. That's what all the articles say. But then something odd appeared. Right?
Yeah.
You figure if there's a chemical imbalance of the brain, in order to treat it, they would have to know what chemicals were out of balance in the brain and by how much. So they would have to give some kind of lab work or some kind of objective test or EKG or something to test what chemicals were out of balance in the brain. That never, ever happened. They don't have any such test. It doesn't exist. They don't know what the chemical imbalance of the brain even should be. It's all a lie that they've perpetuated on this entire planet.
Yeah.
There is no chemical imbalance in the brain. That research has been done and it's come out. So what these suckers have done, and this is mostly the psychiatric mafia and big pharma, they started off with looking for a cause for schizophrenia back in the 50s, uh, and they started blaming mothers. They said, oh, the mothers did something to made the kids schizophrenia. It's how they treated them. You know, the mothers went, what did we do? Tell us what we do. You know, they couldn't come up with anything. So the next thing they came up with was the genetic stuff. It's a genetic disorder. It's caused by genes. You know, so they got away with that for some decade or so before some geneticists finally said, "Well, we're going to look into this." And they say, after the research, they go, "Well, you know, we've tested a bunch of schizophrenics. We don't see a gene for schizophrenia. We just don't see it." And then the psychiatric mafia and big pharma come back and go, "Well, it's not just one gene, it's a bunch of genes, and they're all tangled up, and we'll figure it out one day, but we know it's genetic."
Yeah.
Bull crap. They never have. It's been disproved. Okay, so there's another reason that. See, what they did, they from mothers, they could see mothers, they could talk to mothers. So they needed to kick it up into a level where most people couldn't access to see what was going on. Right? You kick it up into the genetics, then it's only the geneticist who can take a look at what's going on. And it took them a decade or so to get around to it. You know, so after that went, well, we need to kick it up somewhere else where people can't see what's going on, and then they'll just believe what we say. So that was the chemical imbalance thing that Eli Lilly came up with. You know, when Prozac came out. Right? So they're still going with that, even though it's been disproved. They're still saying that. But you know, I had my doubts when I saw that the psychiatrist at the state hospital where I was working never, ever gave any kind of test to determine what chemicals in the brain were out of balance or by how much. So one day I got up and I figured I'd ask one of them, "How do you know what's out of balance? I mean, we're told that this is a chemical imbalance. How do you know what chemicals in the brain are out of balance?" He goes, "Oh, the drug companies tell us. They tell us what drugs are used for these diagnoses, and these diagnoses are kind of connected to some chemical imbalance somewhere." And I'm like, I was like, unbelievable. It's like letting the fox in the hen house. I mean, it's like they trust the drug companies to tell them what's going on. And even the drug representatives didn't have any test for chemical imbalance. I even talked to them when they came to the hospital that sell their drugs. Do you have any test to see what's out of balance or by how much? No, it doesn't exist.
I just think that it was because, or it could possibly be that oxytocin was off balance. So you're saying that that's not true. None of it is true.
Well, there are medical conditions that can cause hallucinations, but when you look at the hallucinations that schizophrenics have, they're running patterns. Regular hallucinations, medical hallucinations don't run patterns. They're all over the place. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're neutral. They're all over the place. They're random. But when you start asking schizophrenics about what the voices are telling them, those voices are always consistently negative, derogatory. You know, they're put down. They will say every rotten thing that you could think of
Right.
about the client. You know?
Yeah.
And then the question becomes is what holds them on a consistently negative path? How come they're not random like regular hallucinations?